Hello, and welcome to Shakespeare in Context with Claire. What a fascinating play. I think that I've had more fun researching this one than any of the others, even though this was not a play I was familiar with. It doesn't seem to be performed much. What a shame. I watched the 1975 version with Jeremy Brett, but I think to really understand the jokes, he would have had to have been fluent in French and English at the court of Queen Elizabeth I. I have also found a significant piece of wordplay that I've been unable to find anywhere else. I hope that you enjoy watching this one as much as I enjoyed making it. Let's start with some dates. The first description of a performance of Love's Labour's Lost appears in a sonnet sequence by Robert Toft, printed in Alba, the Month's Mind of a Melancholy Lover in 1598. Love's Labour's Lost, I once did see a play. Sounds as though he saw it at some time in past memory, not a singular time recently. Walter Cope writes in a letter to Robert Cecil in 1604, describing preparations for the performance of an old play, Love's Labour's Lost, to be performed for the Queen at the Lord of Southampton's. Unless you want to remove to your house on the Strand. A letter by Dudley Carleton in January 1605 states that the Queen, that is Queen Anne, and courtiers joined a feast at Robert Cecil, Lord Cranborne's house, and 2 days earlier had been at Southampton's. Another letter states that on New Year's Day and Twelfth Day a play of Love's Labour's Lost was performed. Love's Labour's Lost was first published in 1598. It had been played before Queen Elizabeth I, the Christmas prior to publication. As it had been newly corrected and augmented, suggests that it might have existed in a different form some time earlier. The play printed for Cuthbert Burby was not entered into the Stationers' Register until 1607, when it was transferred to Nicholas Ling. It was one of the plays listed in Mere's 1598 Palladis Tamia. The style and subject matter suggest that it is an early play. Alfred Harbidge of Harvard University, writing in 1962, asked the question, why should a play written for adult professionals in the mid-90s so much resemble plays written for child professionals in the mid-80s? The resemblance is not superficial. It is observable in content, form and spirit. It seems highly suggestive that all the basic ingredients of the play became available in a cluster in the decade before 1588, and that nothing that became available thereafter was used except incidental phrases. There is no direct source for Love's Labour's Lost. There are similarities with Midsummer Night's Dream, which also has no direct source. Lords and ladies pursue love outdoors and outside the influence and constraints of court. There is also a play within a play performed by the commoners to jibes from the lords and ladies. The pastoral setting and writing of love poems and the stock commedia-style characters are reminiscent of As You Like It. Also, the name Rosaline, although the character Rosaline in this play has more in common with Beatrice, and the verbal sparring between Roslin and Barone are similar to that of Beatrice and Benedick. Love's Labour's Lost, unlike other comedies, does not end with a wedding, but is left unresolved. The resolution Love's Labour's Won, mentioned by Meres, has been found. It was reported by the Globe Theatre that a quarto copy of Love's Labour's Won was discovered in the attic of the theatre. The news article, released on the 1st of April 2021, says, so for all you Shakespeare fans who have been wondering how the lads of Navarre and the ladies of France fared after being parted for a 12-month and a day, well, you'll have to wait just that little bit longer until our summer 2022 season to find out. The play performed at the Globe in 2022 was Much Ado About Nothing, which is thought to be Love's Labour's one under a different name. The basic story is similar to Pierre de la Prémédé's L'Académie Française. The influence of Il Libro Cortegiano, the courtier, is also in evidence, with the courtly manners of the lords and ladies, similar to the courtly plays of Lilly, with the witty teasing women and the scholastic humour of the university wits. The memoirs of Marguerite de Valois weren't published until 1628, far too late for Shakespeare to have used them as a source, although the parallels suggest that the author was familiar with Henry of Navarre and his court. French writer François Rabelais created a character, Bragmardo, similar to Armado, and a pedant named Holofernes. These are stock commedia-style characters: Armado the braggart, Holofernes the pedant, Nathaniel the curate, and Costard the clown. Volume 1 of Académie Française was sent to Henri III with a letter about Pierre's recent visit to Blois, where he said the court was a school erected to teach men that are born to virtue. The book was about 4 young men that spent the days in dialogue. In the introduction to Arden's Shakespeare of Love's Labour's Lost by H.C. Hart, he states, "The story or plot of Love's Labour's Lost is of a very slight nature, with few incidents of any dramatic power. So far as it may be historical, as it appears to be, the origin of the plot is unknown, and we are fairly entitled to say it is Shakespeare's own invention." He goes on to say, "And any reference to this trifling passage in French history of a century and a half previously is scarcely probable. Moreover, if the story had been directly taken from any French origin, there would be much more tangible matter in the play of or belonging to France." We'll begin with the French connection. Is there enough evidence in the play of France or of French origin? And is there evidence that it is not historic but current affairs? Let's look at the characters. Henri became King of Navarre in 1672. When he married Margaret of Valois 2 months later, many of his Protestant friends went to Paris to attend the wedding. A few days after the wedding, Henri's Huguenot friend, Admiral Coligny, was murdered. The unrest in Paris grew, culminating in the Bartholomew Day massacre. Then, for 4 years after this, Henri and his new wife were held at the court of France. During this time, he took a mistress. He was a notorious womanizer, and for this he was given the nickname Le Ver Galant. He managed to escape in 1576 without his wife and returned to his court at Nerac. He was an intelligent and learned man. Although, given his reputation, it's unlikely that Henry would have given up the company of women for 3 years in order to study. It is recorded that when his wife, the Princess de Valois, was allowed to join her husband at Nerac in 1578, he refused to spend time with her. Henri liked writing poetry, and when he wrote, he would use the whole piece of paper, margins and all. In Act 5, when the princess asked what the king has sent with his gift, she waves a piece of scribbled paper and replies, "Nothing but this, yes, as much loving rhyme as would be crammed up in a sheet of paper, writ on both sides of the leaf, margent and all." When he succeeded to the throne of France in 1589, he was hailed Henry the Great and the Gallic Hercules. One portrait shows him as Hercules slaying the Hydra. A genealogy traced the House of Navarre back to a great-nephew of Hercules. This play is filled with references to Hercules. One of the papers I read said that throughout his reign, Henri was known as Hercules, but it was not clear whether this meant his reign as King of Navarre or as King of France. If this play was devised as an early court entertainment, Hercules might also refer to his ally and brother-in-law Hercule François Duc d'Alençon, who negotiated for Elizabeth's hand in marriage between 1571 and 1581. It was on the death of the Duc d'Alençon that Henry of Navarre was first in line to the throne of France. Henri IV was also known as Henri le Grand. The other portrait shows him as a Roman general. In the play within a play, the Roman general Pompey le Grand is played by Costard, who in a funny piece of mistranslation from the French calls himself Pompey the Big instead of Pompey the Great. And what relevance does Disney's film Sleeping Beauty have? It uses the music Marche Henri Grand in the scene close to the end of the film. It didn't use the words though. Long live Henry IV, long live this valiant king, this fourfold devil of 3 talents, of drinking, fighting, and womanizing, of drinking, fighting, and womanizing. Armand de Gontaut, Baron of Biron, might have been the inspiration for the character Biron. He was a commander during the French religious wars. During 1569, he was engaged in negotiations with Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, spiritual and political leader of the French Huguenot movement. In 1571, he negotiated the marriage of Jeanne d'Albret's son, Henri, to Marguerite de Valois. He accompanied the 18-year-old Henri to Paris for his wedding, and was with him when news arrived of his mother's death in June 1572, making Henri King of Navarre. In 1577 he was again to spend time with Henri of Navarre in peace negotiations. They came to terms in September 1577. Henri of Navarre complained about Biron's role as Lieutenant General of Corps. In the play, Biron shows a distinct lack of respect to the King of Navarre. For example, when Biron says, "To see a king transformed into a gnat." However, in 1589, on the death of Henri IV of France, Biron supported Henri de Navarre's accession to the French throne, along with his son Charles Goteau, who is often thought to be the inspiration behind the character Biron. Born in 1562, Charles de Biron seems to have had little to no contact with Henri of Navarre until he became King Henri IV of France. Princess Marguerite de Valois was married to the King of Navarre in 1572. Only 6 days after the marriage, the French wars of religion were resumed with the St. Bartholomew Day massacre. The marriage was not a happy one. Although her memoirs weren't published until 1628, they provide evidence that Shakespeare had knowledge about the court of Navarre. Marguerite was estranged from her husband much of the time. When Marguerite travelled to the court of Navarre in Nérac in 1578, she was accompanied by her mother, Catherine de Medici, and as the Spanish Ambassador Mendoza reports, Catherine de Medici had recently taken a flying squadron of 150 ladies. The purpose of the trip was to discover and the lands of Aquitaine. Boyet says, "Yourself held precious in the world's esteem, to parley with the sole inheritor of all perfections that a man may owe, matchless Navarre, the plea of no less weight than Aquitaine, a dowry for a queen." Notice that he uses the word queen, as Marguerite was a princess de Valois and queen of Navarre. In Act 1, Scene 1, Biron points out the folly of the king's order not to have any women within a mile of court. This article, my liege, yourself must break. For well you know here comes in embassy the French king's daughter, with yourself to speak, a maid of grace and complete majesty, about to surrender up Aquitaine. Therefore this article is made vain. Catherine de Medici's L'escadron volant, Flying Squadron, were described as the most beautiful ladies of her court, who were employed to use their feminine charms and art of persuasion. Aquitaine has been held in surety for money owed, the King of Navarre says. One part of Aquitaine is bound to us, although not valued to the money's worth. If then the king your father will restore but that one half which is unsatisfied, we will give up our right in Aquitaine, and hold fair friendship with his majesty. Another clue to the identity of the princess is given by Costard, who is looking for the greatest lady. Here there is another pun on great, because he is actually the biggest lady. He says, "And your waist, lady, were as slender as my wit." As Costard is thick-witted, she is thick-waisted. In fact, he tactlessly says, "You're the thickest here." A belle lafrangue highlights the extended pun on the French word branler, a brawl, combining it with a dance branle, which Mott describes humorously. The dance branle was in fact Marguerite de Valois' favourite. In the play, Longueville is paired with Maria and Domaine is paired with Catherine. In Act 5, the pairs switch gifts to fool the men, thus switching identities. Louis de Gonzaga had two daughters, Catherine and Marie. In real life, Henri d'Orléans, Duc Longueville, married Catherine, and Henri, Duc de Domaine, married Marie Henriette. Aha! This would seem to fit Shakespeare's sense of fun perfectly. But both would have been too young to be companions to the King of Navarre. Perhaps the fathers would be a better fit. Leonor d'Orléans, Duc de Longueville, seems too young. It is the younger Henry Longueville and the elder Charles Domaine who are traditionally thought to be the real people behind the names. But this is Shakespearean context, and these characters seem to add little to the context of the play. I suspect they are just names that were added later to hide the identity of the real historical people that Shakespeare was writing about. Between 1570 and 1596, France was going through religious turmoil, various factions fighting in the wars of religion. One of these wars later became known as the War of the Three Henrys: Henri de Guise, Henri King of Navarre, and Henri III King of France. The three men, born within 3 years of each other, studied together at the College of Navarre. There is a fourth Henri, Henri de Bourbon, second Prince of Condé, although I can find no evidence for him studying at the College of Navarre. Being the same age as the other three Henrys and of royal blood, it is likely that he studied with the other three. He was a Protestant and fought on the same side as his cousin Henry of Navarre. Henri de Bourbon died after a brief illness in 1588. Later in the same year, Henri de Guise was murdered by Henri III. Then Henri III died in 1589, leaving only Henri of Navarre. Perhaps these Henris were the original inspiration for Shakespeare's characters, but when the play was newly corrected and augmented prior to publication in 1598, 2 of the dead Henrys were switched for 2 live ones: Henri de Longueville, who descended from the King of France, and Henri de Maine from the Guise line. The houses of Longueville and de Mayenne were on the opposite sides to Henry of Navarre, until they swore allegiance to Henry of Navarre at his accession to the throne of France in 1589. The name Baron might also be a later addition, as both Armand Biron and Charles Biron are the wrong age to be college chums with Henry of Navarre. The three men with the King of Navarre in the play could, of course, be entirely fictitious. If all this French history is a bit confusing, I recommend a video about Henri IV, King of France, the Good King, which I will link down below. This family tree shows how Henry of Navarre became next in line to the throne when all four of Catherine de Medici's sons died childless. Let's look at some other context. Throughout the play, there are allusions to the politics of exchange of lands, gifts, and money. Armado gives Costard a remuneration. Now, will I look to this remuneration? Remuneration. Oh, that's the Latin word for 3 farthings. 3 farthings. Remuneration. What's the price of this inkle? 1 penny. No, I'll give you a remuneration. Why, it carries it. Remuneration. Why, it is fairer than a French crown. I will never buy and sell out of this word. There was an inflation crisis in France around 1575 to 1577. Costard has been given 3 farthings by Armado. He is pleased with his remuneration. In his own little bit of role-play dialogue with himself, he asks, how much is this inkle? An inkle being a strip of linen. He replies to himself, 1 penny. Then he replies again, no, I will give you a remuneration, which he understands to be 1/2 penny farthing. He is thus bartering for the inkle with his new word. He thinks that it is a fairer name than a French crown. In 1547, 1 écu was worth 45 shillings. In 1577, it was worth 60 shillings. He would need 2,880 farthings to buy a French crown. That's 720 more than 30 years previously. His remuneration will never buy him a French crown. After these musings, he meets Baron and asks how much carnation ribbon he could buy for remuneration, which he calls 1/2 penny farthing, not 3 farthing. 3 farthings can buy a strip of linen, but how much can 1/2 penny farthing buy of silk ribbon? How much silk ribbon can he buy? Instead of giving the answer in yards, Baron tells him 3 farthings worth. The value of his coins, whether called 1/2 penny farthing or 3 farthings, will only buy a length of ribbon according to the price per yard. Baron gives him a shilling as a guerdon. Guerdon, a French word, has a similar meaning to remuneration, reward or recompense for services rendered, or perhaps a bribe. Costard looks at his guerdon, 1 shilling, and quickly works out that it is 11 pence farthing more than his remuneration, proving that he knows the face value of the coins, but not the intrinsic value. Mott was the ambassador involved in the exchange of gifts between the English and French court. Before we discuss the character of Mott, what else does Shakespeare say about value? Boyet, who accompanies the princess, talks about jewels made from glass. French coinage was changed from being made from silver or gold to base metals instead. The denier silver coin gradually disappeared to be replaced by the denier tournoise made out of copper under Henry III. In 1575, Henry III released the silver franc, with his face printed on it. His face's own margent. Margent could be my silver, mon argent. The king's silver with his face on it. All eyes saw his eyes. Everyone gets to see the eyes of the king imprinted on the franc d'argent. Antoine de Boyet was treasurer to the French king. Was Shakespeare making a comment about the French economic crisis? Was he punning on some other matter? Let's continue with the French connection. Linguistic wordplay. The evidence is that the author was fluent in French and is writing for an audience fluent in French. Armado calls for thy l'envoi. He starts the rhyme. The fox, the ape, and the humble bee were still at odds, being but three. Mott adds the l'envoi, that is, the ending of the rhyme. Until the goose came out the door, staying the odds by adding four. Oie, French for goose, is the same as the ending of l'envoi. The boy says, a good l'envoi, ending in the goose, would I a more. 100 years ago, Abel Lafranc, author of Behind the Mask of William Shakespeare, makes the verbal connection between the ending of l'envoi and the French word for goose, oie. Would you desire more? Well, I have found more to it than just the ending meaning goose. Shakespeare was familiar with plants and their healing properties. Here he uses his knowledge of herbal remedies and his knowledge of French to comic effect. If we return to the start of this scene, Costard ends with a broken shin. Armado says, come thy l'envoi begin. Costard says, oh sir, plantain, a plain plantain, no l'envoi. Plain plantain, Plantago latifolio, was used for healing wounds, also known as lamb's tongue. There is another type of plantain, Plantago maritima, the sea plantain, also known as goose tongue plantain. The ending to a rhyme is l'envoi. Goose tongue in French is langue d'oie. So if I give you the phrase with l'envoi and langue d'oie, and see if you can tell the difference. Oh sir, plantain, plain plantain, no l'envoi, no langue d'oie, no salve sir, but a plantain. He doesn't want the wrong plantain, goose tongue plantain, langue d'oie, a plain plantain, no l'envoi, no langue d'oie. This shows Shakespeare's wordplay can switch between languages. Costard, who has mistaken langue d'oie for l'envoi, ends the story with his own l'envoi. Coster was safely within, fell over the threshold and broke my shin. I haven't been able to find the goose tongue meaning published previously. Please let me know in the comments if you agree with this interpretation, or if you have seen this before. Many people have wondered the underlying meaning to this riddle, and what or who it alludes to. The fox, the ape, and the humble bee were still at odds, being but three, until the goose came out the door, staying the odds by adding four. Could it be an Aesop fable, or linked to the tales of Reynard, as described in my video As You Like It, referring to the pamphlet wars? I think I mentioned in a previous video that Elizabeth called the French ambassador, Simier, her ape. This is about as far as I got. While I was searching the internet and mulling over this riddle, I found one of the best commentaries on a play that I've seen so far. But first, let me summarise. The play had been played before Queen Elizabeth. The Duc d'Alençon's agent Simier, nicknamed Ape, officially arrived in England in 1578. Although not directly related to source material, the latest source appears to be L'Académie Française, published in 1577. Biron conducted peace negotiations with Navarre in 1577. Henry was King of Navarre between 1572 and 1589. Marguerite de Valois, Princess of France and Queen of Navarre, went to the Navarre court in Nérac in 1578. There are allusions to the state of the French economy and introduction of the silver franc in 1577. I think that you might be able to see a pattern here. Next, let's see what Eva Turner Clark thought about Love's Labour's Lost, writing almost 100 years ago. The satirical comedy Love's Labour's Lost, A Study by Eva Turner Clark, 1933. There is so much information in this book, I will only be able to touch on some of the main points. The book is a fascinating read, and there is free access available, which I will link in the comments. The play was newly corrected and augmented by 1597. Clark suggests that due to topical allusions, the original version of the play was written around 1578. There's a tendency of writers of Shakespeare to repeat the work of previous writers. I try to approach the research with fresh eyes. It is so nice then to find confirmation. Clark points out that John Lyly's first novel, Euphues' Anatomy of Wit, was published in 1578. The word wit is used over 40 times in Love's Labour's Lost. The early version of the play not only alludes to events taking place on the continent, but to courtiers back home in England. In the records of the court revels, on Sunday, January the 11th, 1578-79, a double masque was shown before Her Majesty, the French Ambassador, being present, the Sunday after 12th day. A double masque is recorded as a masque of Amazons and a masque of knights, described as an entertainment in imitation of a tournament between 6 ladies and a like number of gentlemen who surrendered to them. The French ambassador present was Georges Simier. Clark thought, as I did, that the 3 young men with the King of Navarre were probably just named later, as the real Baron of Biron accompanied the princess on the visit to Nerac. She thinks that he is a more likely candidate for Boyette. Don Jon seems a good fit for Armado. Traditionalists think that the Spanish character was named for the Spanish Armada, but if you saw my last video, Much Ado, you'll remember that Don Jon led his own armada at Lepanto. Don Jon, who was Governor-General of the Netherlands, was plotting to marry Mary Queen of Scot. Sir Nathaniel, who Clark interprets as William of Nassau, Prince of Orange, fought Don Jon and kept Elizabeth informed of his schemes. His friend Holofernes is the Duke of d'Alençon, who we all know was negotiating to marry Queen Elizabeth I. He was fighting on the side of the Protestants against Don Jon in 1578. He captured the citadel of Mons, which he made his headquarters. Armado asks if Holofernes has the charge house on top of a mountain. Holofernes replies, or Mons, the hill. Anthony Gall, or Antonio de Guaras, was a Spanish agent in England. He established communication between Don Jon and Mary Queen of Scots in a plot against Elizabeth. Arrested on the 20th of October 1577, he was a prisoner in the Tower from June 1578. Costard, Charles III, Seigneur de Croix, Duke of Arschot, was a Catholic noble of the Netherlands and was unfaithful to both Don Jon and Orange. He was an avid coin collector, hence Costard's remunerations and guerdons. d'Arschot, if you drop the H, is an anagram of Costard. Mott, or La Motte, being in secret communication with Don Jon, sold himself and his troops to the Spanish after the Battle of Gembloux. The Princess of France is Marguerite de Valois, Queen of Navarre. Clark thought that the king's attendants and the princess's attendants were modelled on the attendants that accompanied Queen Elizabeth I on her summer progress of 1578. Mary Queen of Scots is alluded to in the character of Jacquinetta. The name is a feminine form of Jacques, French for James, the name that Mary might have been given if she had been born male, following the line of succession in Scotland, as heir to James V and as her son and heir James VI of Scotland. Mary grew up in the French court and spoke French, hence Jacquinetta. After identifying the year 1578, the day-to-day records of the Elizabethan court 1578 makes fascinating reading. I realise that there are a lot of words on this page. You can press pause and read the entries if you'd like to. They are a selection from the Elizabethan Court Day to Day, 1578, which I will link below. The first entry is a gift of a new herbal by Henry Light, the 1586 version which contains a whole chapter on plantain. I was unable to view the original 1578 version. A new Spanish ambassador arrives, the first posting since 1572. The letters from Mendoza to Philip II of Spain gives us a flavour of the political situation at court and abroad. The Prince of Orange and his Protestant allies, including the Duc d'Alençon and the King of Navarre, were fighting the Catholic Philip of Spain's forces, commanded by Don Jon. The Queen is suspicious that the Spanish are trying to stir up strife in Scotland. Don Jon is courting the imprisoned Mary Queen of Scot. Mendoza reports that a man has come in secret from Duc d'Alençon. The named French ambassadors are sent from Catherine de' Medici and her son Henri III. The ambassador, later described as d'Alençon's man, was Jean Simier. I wonder whether this might have been the first visit made in secret prior to his official visit in January 1578-79. Mendoza says that the Queen highly favours Leicester, notwithstanding his bad character. Mendoza says there is much talk of marriage between Philip Sidney and a sister of William, Prince of Orange. Mendoza also reports a dispute over 100,000 ducats that the Queen is owed by the King of Sweden. He says that he does not owe the money and will not pay it. In the play, there is an argument whether the king owes 100,000 or not. The real King of Navarre's ambassador prepares to leave, unhappy with the marriage negotiations with the Duc d'Alençon. Queen Elizabeth I gives him a cipher so that she can continue to correspond with him in secret, while he is serving Navarre in Flanders. Preparations continue for the Queen's summer progress. The King of Navarre describes Don Adriano de Mardo, a man in all the world's new fashion planted, that hath a mint of phrases in his brain, the one who the music of his own vain tongue doth ravish like enchanting harmony. On August 28th, 1578, Sir Francis Walsingham writes to Lord Burleigh from Louvain. As to Don Jon of Austria, surely I never saw a gentleman for personage, speech, wit, and entertainment comparable unto him. The King of Navarre continues, a man of compliments, who right and wrong have chosen as umpire of their mutiny. Right and wrong could refer to the Protestants and the Catholics. Clark says in 1578 he attempted to umpire the destiny of two religious factions of the Low Countries. For a few years following the Battle of Lepanto, Don Jon was the darling of the Western world. He became intoxicated with the glory that came to him. From tawny Spain, lost in the world's debate. The world's debate, religion. He had fought against the Muslims at Lepanto, and again the Protestants in the Low Countries. Boyette reads this intercepted letter from Amado to Jaconetta, which could be an allusion to an intercepted letter from Don Jon to Queen Mary. In Plutarch's Life of Caesar, Plutarch attributes the phrase Veni Vidi Vici to Caesar in a reporter Amantius, a friend of his in Rome, after a swift victory at the Battle of Zela. In the summer of 1577, Don Jon, brandishing the motto In hoc signo vici Turcos, in hoc vincam hereticus, in this sign I conquered the Turks, in this I shall conquer the heretics, began planning for a new campaign in the Low Countries. Don Jon gained a swift victory at the Battle of Combloux in 1578, the one in which Governor of Gravelines La Motte was captured. In a letter from the Spanish Ambassador Mendoza to Philip II, April 12th, he writes, "The Queen was given a letter from Don Jon. doesn't say whether the letter was to the Queen or intercepted. Advising of a victory. A motto using elaborate vocabulary, as Don Jon was noted for in his letters, refers to the tale of King Confetua and Xenophalan. The king falls swiftly in love with a beautiful beggar and marries her. Boyet reads, I am the king, for so stands the comparison, thou the beggar, for so witnesseth thou lowliness. Shall I command thy love? I may. Shall I enforce thy love? I could. Shall I entreat thy love? I will. What shalt thou exchange for rags, robes? For titles, titles? For thyself, me. Thus, expecting thy reply, I profane my lips on thy foot, my eyes on thy picture, and my heart on thy every part. Queen Mary is compared to the beggar in her current state. She has lost everything. He says, witnesseth thy lowliness. He offers to exchange her present state for the state of a queen, with robes, titles, and a husband. I profane my lips on thy foot. To kiss her foot was to pay homage to a monarch. There are a few Hilliard portraits of the Queen like this one in existence. It's likely that Don Jon had a portrait of her to gaze upon. She was described as beautiful, more fairer than the fair, beautiful than beauteous. The princess says, what a plume of feathers is he that he indited this letter! What vein! Don Jon is shown here after the Battle of Lepanto, with a huge plume of feathers on his helmet. His coat of arms has a helmet topped with a plume of peacock feathers, a symbol of pride and vanity. The story is referred to earlier by Armado as the Ballad of the King and the Beggar. He begins, my love is most immaculate, white and red. The Immaculate Heart of the Virgin Mary is surrounded by red and white roses. Mott follows with a ditty about a lady whose red blushes are for shame and pale white skin shows her fear. Catholic Mary Queen of Scots might well have prayed to her namesake, while she was in fear of her life, shamed by her affair with her husband's killer. Mary's all-white mourning garb earned her the sobriquet La Reine Blanche, the White Queen, in 1560, after the death of her first husband. At her execution in 1587, she wore red, the colour of martyrdom. Armado says, his love is immaculate. Mott says, most immaculate thoughts are masked under such colours. That is, impure thoughts are hidden under a mask of religiosity. A dangerous rhyme against the reason of white and red. At a time of growing tension, it was dangerous to outwardly show signs of Catholicism, partly because of the plots, like those of Don Jon, to place the Catholic Queen Mary of Scots on the throne of England. Clark says the Duke of Arschot, leader of the Catholic nobility of the Netherlands, was at one moment the affectionate brother of Orange, and at another devoted follower of Don Jon. Costard's fear that his name will be mentioned in the intercepted letter is almost certainly based on Arschot's fear that his duplicity would be revealed in an actual letter similarly intercepted. D'Arschot kept the Prince of Orange informed of most of Don Jon's plans, who in turn informed Elizabeth. They probably discovered Don Jon's scheme for the invasion of England, and of liberating and marrying the Scottish Queen, and with her occupying the throne. The address of the letter to the sole dominator is a term employed by Don Jon's father. Armado begins his letter by saying he is besieged with sable-coloured melancholy. Motley, speaking of Don Jon early in 1577, says, nothing could be more melancholy than the tone of the governor's letters. Arschot gave Don Jon an account of plots which he had discovered, and showed him a copy of a secret letter written by the Prince of Orange to the Estates, recommending the forcible seizure of the governor. Don Jon spent days in brooding over the news presented by Arschot. Historians speak of frequent spells of melancholy which settled down upon the hero of Lepanto after he became governor of the Netherlands. He was besieged with sable-coloured melancholy. Mardo's references in the letter to Costard and Jaquenetta suggest that Don Jon had learned of Arschot's double-dealing and suspected he was responsible for the failure of Don Jon's schemes against England, particularly in the marriage with Mary Queen of Scots. The letter further suggests that Don Jon was asking Philip to devise some way of punishing Arschot through Antonio de Guaras, the Spanish agent in England. The king reads on, "For Jaquenetta, so is the weaker vessel called, which I apprehended with the aforesaid swain. I keep her as a vessel of thy law's fury, and shall at the least of thy sweet notice bring her to trial." Mary, the weaker vessel, a prisoner of the law's fury, was arrested following the discovery of the casket letters, love letters and sonnets which were written to her lover Bothwell. Bothwell had murdered her husband, and the casket letters implicated her in the collusion of the murder. Antonio de Guaras, who Clark identified as Anthony Dull, was imprisoned as a spy for carrying messages from Don Jon to Mary. Clark's identification of Sir Nathaniel as William of Nassau, Prince of Orange, and Holofernes as Francois Hercule, Duc d'Alençon, I find less convincing. But like I said, the book is free to access, so you can read her reasoning yourselves. In The Rise of the Dutch Republic, 1578, by John Lothrop Motley, he says, "At a great banquet, John Saracen, a Benedictine monk, prior of St. Vast, who had been employed to bring the people over to Don John's side, complained that he attacked upon his own dunghill. The prior, busier than ever in his schemes, was one day arrested along with the other royal emissaries. Interrogated by the central government, he boldly avowed that these pecuniary demands upon the Walloon estates, and particularly upon the ecclesiastical branches, would never be tolerated. In Alva's time, said Saracen, men were flayed but not shorn. Those who were more attached to their skin than their fleece might have thought the practice in the good old times of the Duke still more objectionable. The Iron Duke Alva showed little mercy, executing an estimated 5,000 people. His Spanish troops marched under a banner for the law, the king, and the flock." A few days after his release, the Prior of St. Vast was flitting amongst the Malcontents, blithe and busy as usual when storms were brewing. Matthew Doucet, of the revolutionary faction, a man both martial and pacific in his pursuits, being eminent both as a gingerbread baker and a sword player, swore he would have the little monk's life if he had to take him from the very horns of the altar. Costard says that he will use his remuneration from Armado for Mott to buy gingerbread. The Spanish money would be used to try and bribe the gingerbread baker. The monk, John Saracen, purse in hand, had challenged the rebel general Ambrose to private combat. In half an hour that warrior was routed and fled from the field. There was no resisting the power before which the Montigny's and the Lamottes had succumbed. By September 1578, the Queen started to receive news from Junius de Jonah, the Duke of Cashmere's envoy. Cashmere, Count Palatine, a German prince, had proposed to the Queen in 1564, sending her a portrait of himself. The pacification of Ghent in 1576 was an attempt to unite and pacify the region. Don Jon threatened to renew hostilities. Queen Elizabeth was keen to halt Don Jon. In September, Signor Junius was sent by the Count of Palatine, John Cashmere, to inform the Queen of the straits he was in
and beg for assistance. The Earl of Leicester writes to Walsingham, Duke Casimir's servant Junius had but a cold welcome, nor so good words for his master as no doubt he desires. The man is much grieved, and shall shortly be dispatched, but with little contentation. The Duke of Casimir writes to Leicester from Ghent in December, after capturing the town on the 10th of October. In January, Mendoza writes that Junius took back 8,000 in cash and 14,000 in bills. Biron is talking about being struck by Cupid's bow and falling in love. I think that he's also referring to the visit of the Duke of Casimir's envoy. This Signor Junior, giant dwarf, Dan Cupid, regent of love's rhymes, lord of folded arms, the anointed sovereign of sighs and groans, liege of all loiterers and malcontents. This Senior Junior, Dr. Junius de Jonah, Ghent dwarf, or servant of Lord Cupid, regent of love rhymes, who had previously wooed Elizabeth. Lord of folded arms, the men-at-arms had folded when attacked by Don Jon's forces. The anointed sovereign of sighs and groans. The Treaty of Ghent didn't hold because there was too much complaint among the various factions. Liege of all loiterers and malcontents. While Casimir was loitering in Ghent, his previous allies, the Malcontents, including Mott and Arschot, who Clark identified as Costard, had joined forces with Don Jon, dread Prince of Plackets, King of Codpieces, sole Imperator and Great General of Trotting Paritors, sole Imperator, Commander-in-Chief, and Great General of Paritors, officers who summon witnesses and execute the orders of an ecclesiastical court. Oh, my little heart, and I to be a corporal in this field, and wear his colours like a tumbler's hoop. The colours white and blue are associated with William, Prince of Orange. William is reported to have used these colours in 1577 as part of his procession entering Ghent. You can imagine them seeming quite garish, like ribbons on a tumbler's hoop.
If you read any commentaries on Love's Labour's Lost, you will find many different historical characters thought to be the characters alluded to in this play. It can all get a bit confusing. I don't think you can say that Shakespeare thought this character is based on this person and strictly adhere to it. He obviously picks up on certain character traits, but I think most of the time he is just alluding to a whole host of characters that were involved in the political situation and events of the time. What you can say with complete certainty is that he is alluding to events happening on the continent in 1577 and 1578. You can also be certain that the author of this play was in on the court gossip. The reports by Mendoza are interesting because he's reporting the type of information that would be available to courtiers, statesmen and ambassadors, but not the type of information that would be available to the general public. This play possibly contains more identifiable topical allusions than any other play in the canon. It was an entertainment written for courtiers and ambassadors early in the writer's career. Satire in subsequent plays was toned down, as was this play when it went through a rewrite. It makes no sense to write these allusions 20 years later, after many of the people alluded to have died, but it does make sense that in the rewrite these allusions sneaked into the final cut. So as Love's Labour's Lost is to be concluded, so is this part of Love's Labour's Lost in context. If you are still wondering about who the author is, or you have a favourite, have a look at the candidates and see if you think they were in the right place at the right time. Perhaps you would like to take a look at the play again and read through the Elizabethan court day by day, 1578. There will be a lot more to say about Elizabeth's progress in 1578 in the next video, and the later rewrite before the play was published 20 years later. Please let me know what you think about this video and any ideas you have in time for the next one. Thank you for watching Love's Labour's Lost, Part 1, The French Connection, in context with Claire. As always, I will leave links to sources in the pinned comments below. Please like and subscribe and press the bell icon to be notified of the next video. I would really love to hear your comments, whether you agree or disagree. But remember, please be kind.